And they all lived happily ever after. Wait, I'm supposed to say that at the end, aren't I? Let me back up a second. When we last gathered, we were left on a cliffhanger as Ruth and Naomi set out for Bethlehem in hopes of settling down and surviving there off what little living they could muster up. At this point, we haven't yet found out whether or not they even made it back home. For all we know, they could have decided to join a roving caravan of circus performers, or decided to step into that strange-looking wardrobe they came across only to find themselves in a fantastical, far-off field. But as we all know, that's not actually what happens next. What transpires in this short tale as it continues reveals that while God does not speak directly in the story, his beautiful plans continue to unfold in unexpected and intriguing ways. While our reading for today was a bit of a highlight reel of what was to come, I want to remind us it's important that we take Ruth as a whole story rather than as chunks. And so while I want to explore the significance of Ruth's story for our faith today, I want to make sure we look at this story so we can better comprehend just what is really going on here. Following Ruth's incredible commitment speech to remain with Naomi as family, the two find themselves heading to Bethlehem toward uncertain fortunes. As we come to find out, they arrive in Bethlehem safe and sound at a rather opportune time, because the very important barley harvest has begun. The famine of food has truly come to an end as they see the fields before them flush with beautiful crops. But this backdrop calls for us to recognize that while one famine has indeed ended, another is still very much a reality for these two. Ruth and Naomi are still widows. And Naomi probably recognizes that at this point in her life, that's what she will always be. But Ruth just might have a chance. Surprisingly, though, the story very quickly jumps to the action of introducing us to Boaz. Now, it's not so much a surprise that it moves quickly into this. However, it's surprising because it says that Boaz was a relative of Elimelech. But it was just very recently we heard Naomi say she had no living male relatives. It sort of leaves us wondering if, due to the sheer emotional weight of loss, Naomi simply forgot about these living relatives in a momentary lapse of memory, or if she was simply just trying to really just get rid of Ruth and Orpah. Because as we find out later, Boaz isn't even the closest living male relative that Naomi has in her family through Elimelech. And that will actually come into play later for Ruth and Boaz. Nevertheless, we come to find out that Boaz is an excellent candidate for the next season of The Hebrew Bachelor, given what we read about him. The Hebrew describes him as Ish Kail, which translates best as a man of quality and strength. We also find out, not coincidentally, that Ruth has determined to go and glean in the fields this day in order to begin providing for her and her mother-in-law, Naomi. Now, Naomi does not protest this at all, despite all the risks involved in being a Moabite widow in Israel. She acquiesces rather easily to Ruth's plans. And if you read this with a keen understanding of where Naomi is at emotionally, you can almost hear her as a hurting and depressed woman quietly responding to Ruth with little concern or care at all for what she plans to do this day or any day for that matter. She is consumed by her grief at this point, and her doubts of the future weigh heavily on her. But Ruth goes. Ruth is hopeful that someone in the community will at least be partially sympathetic to her plight. She finds herself in the fields of none other than Boaz. and she begins to glean. Now, gleaning is a technical term for those who are not familiar with it. In Israel, it was kind of the welfare system, essentially, for those who were on the down and out. When hired workers would pass through the field for harvesting, they are allowed to bundle the grain they have cut, but of course there are bound to be some missed sheaves of their grain while they're working. That grain in particular that they have overlooked or passed over or dropped behind them is to be left behind for the poor, for the widows, the strangers, the foreigners, and the orphans, all those who have no direct access to society in those days, so that they could find a way to live at least somewhat better. It's a most difficult and meager way to survive, though, let's be honest. But this foreign widow Ruth has very little choice at this point. Now, it isn't long until Boaz shows up to check on his workers and greets them with kind words of love. And they respond similarly to him, further cementing the idea that Boaz is a well-respected and beloved man in this community. He isn't disengaged from his workers, but like a good boss, he has built a powerful relationship with them. Along with that, he clearly pays attention to those on the down and out who are gleaning in his field because he notices Ruth in particular. He finds his overseer, the kind of the manager of this particular field, and he inquires about this woman he notices who is gleaning, working very hard to collect this barley. The overseer explains who she is, where she is from, and how she is caring for this widow Naomi. And she has only taken one break since she started working in the morning, which should ring as significant because he brought it up at all. Boaz is so impressed that he grants her special care and protection. She is astounded, and she's even given extra blessings beyond the requirements for gleaning. Remember that word hesed from last week? It's kindness and grace beyond what is required. Once again, hesed has shown up through Boaz now. He even asks his workers to pull extra stalks and leave them behind for Ruth to collect. He is literally giving away his crops at this point. When Ruth returns home that night, Naomi inquires as to her gleaning time for the day. Perhaps she recognizes just how much barley and grain Ruth has collected and is astounded that this one person could bring home such a bountiful harvest for them. Ruth tells Naomi whose field she has brought this barley and grain from, and Naomi almost leaps for joy off the pages that we read at what she hears. She suddenly remembers Boaz and how he is a relative of Elimelech's family. Sort of convenient, isn't it? Naomi has probably already started cranking and thinking about how to be able to get Ruth to be able to marry Boaz. But for now, she tells Ruth, continue gleaning in his field. With this special attention, you're not going to find that anywhere else. Stay gleaning there for now. After several weeks then, the harvests have concluded, and Naomi has finally had time to wrap her mind around her scheme for Ruth and Boaz. She instructs Ruth to glam herself up, go to the threshing floor, and wait for Boaz to fall asleep there. Once he has settled in for the night, Naomi instructs Ruth to find her way to him quietly and make her move. There's an obvious PG-13 undertone here. This story is truly a romance story after all. But Ruth obeys her mother-in-law, and when she finally meets Boaz on the threshing floor, he is fast asleep. So she lies there waiting for him to awake. When Boaz is finally awoken, he is startled awake. We don't necessarily hear exactly maybe what it was, but for some reason or another, something wakes him up in the middle of the night, and he finds Ruth lying there. But instead of shooing her away, He is enamored that she has chosen him rather than another. The two appear destined for each other. He is ready to fulfill that role of what is called guardian redeemer for her and Naomi. He is willing to take Ruth as his wife and make it right. Except there's a problem. There is another man who, legally speaking, is more closely related to Naomi than he is. And that means he has the first option to fulfill that role. It seems Boaz has no choice but to seek him out and allow him to decide whether he will take Ruth first. Ruth spends the rest of the night there, and Boaz sets out in the morning to settle the matter immediately. He ushers her out discreetly, though, so as not to make anyone aware that a woman has spent the night there with him. He shares some barley with her as well to kind of make it look on the up and up. And she returns home to an expectant Naomi to share what has happened. Naomi is pleased because one way or another, Boaz will settle the matter as quickly as possible. Now, without getting into too many of the details here, we also now find out that Boaz finds this next in line kin very easily and rather fortuitously at the gate of the town. He then also gathers 10 elders from the town to witness to this exchange and discussion to ratify it. They discuss things, and through a manner of shrewd negotiations, Boaz convinces this other man to pass not only on marrying Ruth, but on some land that comes along with that. They ratify this transfer of land, and Boaz returns home to finally declare that he, in fact, will marry Ruth. The two are joined, and the story concludes with the birth of Obed. In true Hebrew fashion, this birth adds to the family tree another link to David, the future king of Israel. And so we are shown several generations in conclusion from Perez, who began in Genesis, all the way to David. Now, from last week, we already know the value of trusting our God, the King of all the universe. Even in spite of very daunting mountains to climb, Ruth sticks with Naomi in returning to Bethlehem, where the two very easily could have been overlooked, taken advantage of, or perhaps even killed. But beyond this, now that we have read through the entirety of this story, we come to note something very peculiar about this book. In a time of patriarchy, where men reigned supreme, women were routinely dismissed and overlooked because it was men who led the charge. Much of our history that we read in the Old Testament is driven by the males of the story. But this story stands in stark contrast to that pattern. It is Ruth and Naomi who move the story along every step of the way. Even Boaz, who wheels and deals his way into marriage with Ruth, only does so because Ruth boldly approaches him at night while he is sleeping. It is very evident that in spite of a male-dominated culture back then, women played a pivotal role in God's redemptive work. The powerful voice of a woman in this story cannot be overlooked. Even more importantly, I think, though, for us to remember is this: God is a matchmaker. Some of you are probably thinking, a matchmaker? Really? Yes, and let me explain what I mean by that. While Naomi was working to bring Ruth and Boaz together through her own plans, God was working behind the scenes, knitting together the virtues of Ruth with the people of Israel. Many biographies help us understand a significant individual by telling stories that predate the subject of the story. It tells their history as well, giving us a sense of the soil from which this significant person has grown. There are a variety of influences that make us who we are, including our families of origin. the story of King David, the man after God's own heart, from whom the Messiah will one day come to rule Israel forever, has roots in the soil provided by the Moabite widow Ruth. Despite all the charges not to marry foreign women, God works through Ruth in a very powerful way to bring about his plans. Long before David was more courageous than any member of the Israelite army and took on and defeated Goliath, a young woman named Ruth daringly left her home to care for her vulnerable mother-in-law. Generations before David spent those quiet days shepherding his father's flock, a young Moabite woman humbled herself to glean from the edges of the harvest to provide for her family. Ages before David was plucked from obscurity and anointed as the next king of Israel by Samuel, Boaz noticed Ruth working in the fields, and through Naomi's matchmaking, the two were married. The virtues of Israel's greatest king can be traced back to his great-grandmother. God was in the midst of the famine, sowing seeds of love for the people of Israel that were ultimately grown through Ruth. And while it's fun to think we can finally say, and they lived happily ever after, the reality is the larger story of God still isn't over yet. As part of God's family now, we may not be able to trace ourselves back to biblical greats, but we have a role to play in continuing to uphold the virtues displayed in Ruth, David, and many others from God's word. We have seeds of love to continue planting and watering so that they may grow to fullness and bear fruit that continues the story. Ruth's story calls us to recognize our own role in God's story. We, too, need to be willing to humble ourselves and do the hard work of caring for the hungry. We, too, are called to risk our comfort and walk side by side with one who is vulnerable. We, too, should trust that God is at work, even when things don't appear to be going our way. It's easy to pray to God and await results, but write off silence as simply God's will. And sometimes it is. But I think too often we fail to recognize that God may not be being silent, but waiting for us to be the answer ourselves. In a world that is so broken and hurting and in need of someone who loves them, we may very well be the one God is calling to follow in Ruth's brave footsteps and reach beyond our borders to show compassion and grace to someone who needs it. Seeds aren't planted by sitting idly by. They find their place to germinate in soil by the work put in by the sower. And if God has planted seeds within us, what fruit will we then be able to bear which he can use through us to plant more seeds in this world? Like Ruth, how will we stay committed to our covenant relationship with God and step out in faith when the going gets tough? And when Christ returns in glory at the end of days to finally bring about his kingdom in fullness, how many will find themselves in a truly happily ever after, worshiping the Lamb on his throne forever? Amen.